Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's C-O-M-B-E-S-T, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?
It's me, Egbert, once again. I'm the new owner of this station. I went out and hired the best talk radio consultant, Jeff Allen from News Talk STL, and told him to hire the worst talent he could find. Jeff did exactly as I told him. Ladies and gentlemen, here are Brad and John.
See what a nice guy Jeff Allen is? If that were a little vignette about Tracy and Rick Ellis, I'd have another cease and desist letter. You know what I'm saying?
You would. And, one of the great things I learned from Jeff Allen when I met him one time, which didn't happen in real life, but in my imagination, he was wearing a WWBHD bracelet. What would Bob Hyland do? And it was inspirational to me. So I went out and I printed out a picture of Bob Hyland, and I just have it up right here so that I can look at it whenever I need a little inspiration.
What you've said is over the heads of about 99.9%.
But you know what? Sometimes if one person named Brad Hildebrand gets a laugh out of it, and maybe smartest in the woman in the world, or maybe like a Mike Otten, then we're good, Brad.
Okay, what we talked about was, going into this break, was the fact that a lot of the car manufacturers are deleting AM from their car radios. And what's sort of interesting about this, Ford has done an about-face. They've said, no, we're going to keep it. But the interesting thing about Ford is they didn't delete it. This is one of the firmware things where it's in the firmware. They just turned the firmware off. In other words, and I think...
Isn't that amazing?
Well, I think that if I read the article, I can't remember exactly how they said they're going to do it. But if you have a car that has been manufactured and it's a new Ford vehicle, truck, whatever you bought, SUV, and it has the AM deleted, if you take the car back to the dealership, they're going to plug into your OBD2 port and turn your AM back on. Okay, now, here's the interesting thing. The federal government, FEMA, has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to essentially outfit AM radio stations with backup transmitter sites. The reason I know this is years ago when Joe Geerling was the chief engineer for Entercom, now Odyssey, and he invited me over to the KMOX transmitter site, which is sort of interesting because it's in the middle of nowhere.
And where is it?
It's over in Illinois. It's on 162. Okay. 162 runs parallel to 270, about maybe 2 miles south of 270, and it's between 111 and 157, okay? And matter of fact, it's interesting. For a long time, there was nothing else around it. Now there's a junkyard next to it, a car junkyard. And it's a relatively big site, one little tower. Well, I shouldn't say one little tower. Probably, I think the tower's about 300-400 feet tall. Big old building. And right next to it is another interesting structure. And when I went over there, I said, Joe, what's that? And he goes, oh, that's the FEMA installation. I go, the FEMA installation? He says, yeah, this is part of the federal government. What they've done is they have a complete another backup of everything we have, but better. And I go, what do you mean better? He takes me over there, and we couldn't go in. It's all locked up. You can't go in there. It's a complete system, the broadcast with the studio, the whole bit, and it's EMP protected. You know what I mean by that?
No, what's that?
EMP is electromagnetic pulse. And the idea behind this is that there are supposedly weapons that that we supposedly have them, and the Russians and the Chinese people have them, that what they do is they're a nuclear bomb, but they blow up way up in the atmosphere, like maybe 10 miles above the ground. And what they do is they create this incredible electromagnetic pulse, which burns up all the circuitry. You know how like sometimes if your house gets hit by lightning, even though you don't get a direct strike, like your computer doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, that's essentially an EMP. Well, what this is like a lightning strike on steroids. Okay, so they have a complete another system installed by the federal government sitting right next to the KMOX building, which has a complete another transmitter, but a special transmitter that has all this EMP protection in it. It has living quarters in it, has big monster generators, and it has monster fuel tanks where the thing can run like at full power for 2 weeks or some crazy thing like that. And this is all put in by the government. KMOX, the owners didn't do that. And the reason they did that was because their philosophy is if the stuff does hit the fan, or what's Shelley used to say, the defecation hits the rotary oscillator, whatever she used to say. Anyway, the idea being is that if the cellular system goes down, everything goes down, people will still have their AM radios that they can listen to for emergency information. Well, the problem with that is if all of a sudden you don't have it in their cars anymore, you're sort of screwed. So
and if you don't have an AM radio handy.
Right. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there was, I believe it happened last month, where Rand Paul was being interviewed I believe by one of his stations in Kentucky, one of the cities. I can't remember what station it was or what city it was, but he was being interviewed by a fairly high-profile broadcaster in his home state of Kentucky, in one of the local radio stations. And the guy, the talk show host, asked him up front, Rand, why are you not promoting this keep the AM radio in cars thing? And Rand Paul's philosophy was, he came out and said, here's what I don't like about Republicans. And Rand, I think, would call himself a Republican. He essentially said, the Republicans are for no government until it impacts them, and then they want government. So in other words, he's essentially saying, hey, you bunch of broadcasters, you conservative broadcasters, you're saying we got too much government, but yet you want government. Well, but once again, I fall back to my thing where people say, well, you're a libertarian, you're like an anarchist. No, libertarians feel that there are reasons that we have laws. You drive on the right side of the road. If you don't drive on the right side of the road, you get arrested. You know, you don't murder people. You don't, you do, in other words, but what the libertarians don't like is the fact that there's 14 million crazy, stupid laws that on a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, you can't make a left turn on Lindell Avenue unless the moon's full. You know what I mean? It's crazy stuff like that. That you go like, okay, what in the world is that? And they went and got into a big argument. And the interesting thing was, I wish this broadcaster would have known about the federal government, because if I would have said that, Rand Paul would come back at me. I go, hey, Mr. Paul, guess what? The government has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars for these installations at radio station sites that the government has put in, backup equipment, so that if the stuff does hit the fan and the KMOX transmitter gets fried, yet they will be able to, turn on this transmitter, and away we go. Now, the sad part of this whole situation is, and I'll say it again, and I don't mean to sound like I'm being a jerk when I bring this up, but we have all these rules and regulations on us about EAS, emergency alert system, and stuff like that. 9/11. Guess how many EAS messages were sent?
0.
Exactly.
Yeah. The
EAS system never went off. And to the point where it's like, okay, so why do we have this system when nobody pulls the trigger? I mean, now, what you hear on a lot of stations, and not necessarily ours, you hear is the weather. You hear the tests and the weather broadcasts and stuff like that. A lot of stations have put in the Amber Alert things, where you've heard that same things you get on your cell phone and stuff like that. And that's done on essentially a local and a county level. And the problem is that on a federal level, who pulls the trigger? Like when, and I don't mean to be facetious when I say this, but when Joe Biden is sitting on his lawn chair, or his beach chair on the beach in Delaware, and something happens, who pulls the trigger? And like we had the situation with Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, when he was in the hospital.
Incapacitated.
Right, and he is again. Did you know this? Do you know that story?
Yeah. And so his number 2 in command had no idea that he was incapacitated.
No, he's incapacitated again.
Wait, this happened again?
Oh, yeah, he's still in hospital.
Oh, no, I haven't heard this. When did this happen?
Oh, he had a bladder infection and he had to go into emergency surgery or something like that just earlier this week, I think.
Wow. No, I didn't hear the follow-up to that. But This is the second time that's happened.
Well, yeah. Well, actually, it's the third time, because of the fact that the crazy part of this is the first time he had, once again, he didn't tell anybody he has cancer, so he went in for some kind of prostate surgery. And then that was the first time, and he was in for a couple of days, but nobody said anything. And then he got really sick, some kind of an infection or something like that, some post-op problem. And he got really sick, and they put him in the ICU, and he was, squirreled away, and nobody knew where he was for the second time. And now the third time, essentially, I think he learned his lesson. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, there comes a point, and hopefully it'll be little bit further down the road for me. But there comes a point in every person's life where you have a high-profile job where you have to say, you know what, I just can't do this anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
I mean, I'm not doing my, I could say I'm a tough guy and I'm going to soldier on and I'm going to continue to do what I do because I'm an important person. But you have to get the introspective aspect of your life and say, you know what, big picture, I can't do this anymore. I heard an interesting thing yesterday that they say two reasons that Joe Biden does not step aside and he's trying to get reelected in 2024 this year is reason number one, it's him, that he's always been, the glory guy. He always wants to be, they talked about how he's run for president 4 different times in three different decades. Did you know that?
Yeah, so he ran in 88, which was famously chronicled by the book What It Takes.
Right.
Which is an awesome, that book by Richard Ben Kramer.
Right.
And that was where I first heard about Joe Biden and just the ridiculous stories about, his speech plagiarism and things of that regard. Not to interrupt. So that was 88. And then he ran in the 90s and then in the 2000s and now in 2024.
Well, they say the 2 reasons he doesn't give up is because his old selfishness, and he's, he likes the lifestyle and he likes being the president a whole bit, and his wife.
Oh, really? Yeah, Jill. Dr. Jill, excuse me.
Yeah, that she is the one that she wants to, this sounds sad when I say this, but I've known this myself, where there are guys that have a great wife, and at one point in time, their wife says to them, honey, you just have to stop doing this. You know what I'm saying? I mean, whatever it is. If they're...
You mean in a positive and helpful and supportive way?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, because she's looking out for his best interest, and she can. And what is the number one limiting factor of men in general? Their ego. Well, so if you have a woman that can help you in a positive, constructive way get that in check, who doesn't want that? Well, I guess you don't want that if she's telling you to quit whatever your quote unquote passion is.
Well, but I don't want to. Once again, what is the old saying? Behind every man, there's a great man. There's a great woman. I mean, let's be honest. Women sometimes see a perspective that dudes just don't see. You know what I'm saying?
Correct. Yeah. When men are especially when men are blinded by their ego.
Right. Or by passion or by fury or I mean how many times do you see in your real life videos of guys who are trying to duke it out, and there's a woman saying, honey, don't do this.
Trying to talk sense. Yeah. Trying to short circuit that male aggression.
Whatever man could do, woman can do better. Whatever man can do, I'm telling you, that's my motto. Whatever man can do,
I know that
woman
is. Now,
can do
you and I might disagree on that, because if that were the case, remember, Brad, we'd see a lot of female construction workers helping, lay some tile or lay some, asphalt.
Well, there are female construction workers out there. Not very many of them. Matter of fact, it's interesting because if you ever watch Piers Morgan, he talks about this all the time, that women, they want equal rights, but yet women don't want to work construction for the most part. There are some that do.
I got you off track, but I get what you're saying, Brad. You were talking about the Joe Biden effect.
Right. Okay. Next thing. This came out yesterday, and a lot of people in my industry went, what the hell is this? Odyssey, which is right here in St. Louis, that owns KMOX and Y98 and KZK and 97.1, has had some rough times, as a lot of us broadcasters have. It's not been, the last 10, 15 years have not been good in the radio business because of another different reasons, competition. And then, first if you go back the last 20 years, we had 9/11, then we had the economic meltdown in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and then most recently in 2020, and still to this day, the crippling effects of the coronavirus thing, okay? Odyssey has declared bankruptcy. One of the investors who is willing to put hundreds of millions of dollars in to essentially end up with an ownership share of Odyssey, if I gave you 10 guesses, you'd never guess.
I have no idea.
George Soros.
Wow. Hey, you know what? You want to get your tentacles in whatever form of message distribution you can.
George Soros, who is the guy who put a lot of money behind the campaign to put Kim Gardner in as DA and a lot of DAs around the country. George Soros has floated a plan where I think he's willing to put in $415 million. I think that was the number. Essentially close to $500 million into the bankruptcy restructuring plan, and ideally that if it gets approved, he will essentially, his company that he's funding this through, will become the majority owner of the Odyssey radio stations. Now, what's interesting is he's already bought, through another company, he's bought 18 Spanish language stations.
Interesting. Well, they are taking over the United States, Brad. That's part of his plan.
Well, so I'm thinking to myself, oh, man. And there's a whole interesting thing about this is that if you look at what's happening to the newspaper business, I mean, in the state of Missouri.
Yeah.
There are interesting companies that are coming in and buying. Matter of fact.
And snatching up for pennies on the dollar, right, Brad?
Right. And mainly what they're doing is, just like you talked about with this, what is the Springfield News Leader? Is that what it is with Springfield?
Yeah, that's their paper down there.
Okay.
Now, that's Gannett. That's owned by the Gannett family.
Right. But what they have done is they have essentially scaled back the employment to minimal standards.
Oh, yeah.
And they're sharing a lot of stories amongst their other papers. Like, isn't the paper in Columbia, isn't that a Gannett station?
Correct, yeah. So you'll see very few. You'll see a school district story here and there, either out of Columbia or Springfield that's unique. And the rest of it is just generic. And as you know, Brad, most of it is USA Today stories, just syndicated stories taking up space.
Right, and in their standard style, very short form, very short read kind of stories.
Yep.
And a long time ago when I interviewed Danny Wizentowski, who did the American Skyjacker thing, who's now over at KWMU, but when he was with the Riverfront Times, see, I say it again, and sometimes people sort of poo-poo the Riverfront Times. They do some excellent long-form journalism.
Then they have for decades. That's
right.
True.
And it's not this little, 4 or 5 paragraph story. We're talking, 10,
really good stuff. Yeah.
I don't know.
They've had a long series of men and women that have written great pieces. A guy named Chad Garrison was there. They've had some really, really good reporters there.
And very, very thorough and in-depth reporting. Now, a lot of people, it's that they got sort of known as the magazine that, you'd find out where all the
prostitutes and whatever, strip clubs or whatever.
Yes, you said it quite nicely. Back in the day,
the back page, the former back page whole thing.
Right, the classified ads, for, all the...
Desperately seeking whatever.
That kind of stuff.
Desperately seeking Susan.
And the sad part of that is that most of the big papers, like even the Post-Dispatch, they don't have the depth to do that kind of stuff anymore. Although they still do some very good reporting, and I will give the Post, their due. But once again, it's not like in the old days where, back in the old days when you became a cub reporter, so to speak, your first job was you did the police beat, where you went every day, you went down to the police station and you went through the crime reports.
And you saw if anybody famous had been arrested, or you see names that you would recognize or that are repeat offenders or whatever.
Yeah. Right. And you essentially look at this. Look at this. But I think those days are sort of gone. Anyway. That's what happened to get to be an old guy like me, See, you know what I need? I need a Jill Biden in my life. That's what I need. I need a Jill Biden.
Hey, have you seen some pictures of her from the 70s?
Why do you ask?
Because they're fantastic. There's at least one that's like one to right click and save, Brad. That's what I would say.
Jill Biden, okay. Yeah, I've heard her ex-husband talk about her, but that's a whole other story. Have you ever heard those stories?
No, I have not. Is that something I should Google?
It's interesting. He said some interesting things about her. So, as a matter of fact, supposedly, I can't remember this. I shouldn't say anything, but supposedly she was, shall we say, fawning over Joe when they were still married.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Understood.
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?